If you were a kid in the 90s who grew up with Nickelodeon, then you know just how risky of an idea the original NickToons were. For reasons that I will explain, it's not hyperbole to say that it changed the course of animation history going forward. So why exactly did the network made to promote, celebrate, and create some of the most prominent cartoons become Nickelodeon's dumping ground for low-budget cartoons that they no longer had any faith in? Why did NickTunes Network fail? NickTunes Network premiered on May 1st of 2002, but originally started off as just a programming block 11 years prior. But when Nickelodeon itself was created as a network in 1979, it featured little to no animation at all. And when it did feature animation, it wasn't animation that fit the norm of the time. Now, I know that sounds confusing, but as I mentioned in my preschool days video, which you should definitely go check out, every decade of cartoons starting from the 60s to now had its own formula for success as animation on television became more successful. But to touch on that a little bit more in depth, the 60s gave us shows that centered around family values and would usually feature the adults as the main characters instead of children. Which led us into the 70s that gave us fictional bands in the likes of Josie and the Pussycats, Jabberjaw, the Brady Kids, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kids, and the Jackson 5. A true classic. The 70s also had a thing for superheroes and their friends while superheroes were starting to grow in popularity. Nickelodeon as a network premiered just at the edge of this decade, and at the time weren't creating their own shows, let alone creating their own cartoons. The only animations seen on the channel were in sketch shows that would vary in quality and would jump from live action to animation and everything in between. And that would be the case for Nickelodeon over the next decade. The network went through the entirety of the 80s without creating any animated content. All of our cartoons were starting to skyrocket in popularity, and not just popularity, but a profitability unlike ever before. How, you ask?
Is this the end for Donatello?
Eat this, turtle breath.
Action figures, toys, posters, toothbrushes, candy, which is redundant, costumes, car fresheners, underwear, you name it, it was made, and kids could not get enough of it. In the decades prior, cartoons were made mostly for entertainment purposes, and they'd make money through the ads that ran as the show played. But now, the 80s, cartoons weren't made by cartoonists or their ideas, but were manufactured by studios in order to sell toys. Studios even went as far as to make sure each character was the same copy-paste of one another so they could be able to reuse the toy modes for each character. Genius, if you're a sleazy rich white guy, but every studio had agreed that this idea was genius. Every studio except Nickelodeon. While the cartoons who were using that formula were definitely making money and plenty of it, Nickelodeon saw an opportunity. I know a lot of us see these cartoons as really cool and nostalgic, because a lot of them are really cool and nostalgic. But we also need to remember that for every Transformers, He-Man, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were 20 really generic and boring cartoons that were clearly made just to sell toys and for no other reason. Outside of a few gems, cartoons were starting to look dull, boring, and most importantly, creatively bankrupt. So at the tail end of the 80s, when all hope was looking to be lost, Nick would put 3 cartoons into production, and by August 11th of 1991, Nickelodeon would finally premiere their very first NickToons. And NickToons made sure that you knew these cartoons weren't just cartoons, but they were creator-driven cartoons.
Here at Nickelodeon, we make cartoons!
Yep, make them. Not just any old tunes.
Your tunes. Nick makes tunes for you!
For
you!
Oh.
So does that mean that Nickelodeon wouldn't market to the kids in the same way the cartoons of the 80s did? Hell no it doesn't! Nickelodeon took advantage of making that money. But the difference was, the cartoons were made by the creators and their wacky ideas, rather than being studio mandated to push toys. So these cartoons became an instant hit. The pen was put back in the artist's hand, and that resonated with people. So the success of the first big 3 not only made a name for Nickelodeon as a network, but opened the floodgates for more Nicktoons to be made. All Real Monsters, Rocko's Modern Life, Cat Dog, Kablam, Hey Arnold, and many more. All of these cartoons gave Nickelodeon a certain level of legitimacy that they didn't have before. So that would inspire Nickelodeon to make the leap from just animation on TV to movies families would have to pay to watch in theaters. which was a big risk for the network, but one that will ultimately pay off for them by the Rugrats becoming the first non-Disney animated movie to make over $100 million in the domestic box office alone. After that, the 90s were starting to come to a close, and the NickToons, especially the Rugrats, were starting to make NickToons a household name. But right before the 90s came to an end, Nickelodeon would premiere their most successful show to date, and also the first crack in this network's sinking ship.
SpongeBob SquarePants, only on the best place to turn for new tunes, your Nickelodeon.
Oh boy, now's my chance.
SpongeBob SquarePants coming Saturday morning in 2 weeks. Be there and be square.
SpongeBob premiered on July 17th of 1999 and quickly became one of the network's most successful series ever. And while the Nicktoons that were had come to an end with the decade, there were still a few shows from before trying to stay alive on the network. Rugrats was still ongoing, SpongeBob had just started, and Hey Arnold was holding on for dear life. But even with the 2000s bringing on new tunes and introducing many beloved characters to us, it became obvious really quick that the network had only room for one cartoon, and that cartoon was SpongeBob. So while all the other shows desperately tried to stand out, they will ultimately end up taking a back seat. So much so that SpongeBob even managed to completely overshadow the network's most popular show ever at the time. No one could have forecasted the success of SpongeBob, not even Nickelodeon themselves. SpongeBob had become so successful that he transcended being a Nicktoon at all. He overshadowed Nicktoons as a brand, but Nick still wanted to give them a chance. Nicktoons started off as an experiment anyways, so why not give these other cartoons a chance to grow on a channel that's made just for them?
As you all know, the NickToons will soon be charging into battle, becoming a brand new 24-hour network. Some have said that the NickToons did not want this fight. Well, that's a bunch of conch shells, mister. The NickToons love the sting of battle.
So on May 1st of 2002, NickToons TV would premiere, and would consist of both old and new shows from the channel's parent network, and didn't run ads for the channel for the first 3 years. They would use the network as a way to promote their current cartoons, and also keep the name of NickToons alive, even though all the quote-unquote new cartoons they had were already premiered on Nickelodeon. And for really good reason. SpongeBob is an incredible show, but it was beginning to give Nickelodeon an unhealthy obsession with over-relying on SpongeBob and using him as a crutch, instead of, taking a risk and seeing if that led to a show succeeding. Nicktoons as a brand was going further and further downhill day after day. And the once Nickelodeon that was held to such a high standard for its animation was now only pushing SpongeBob alongside its live action shows. And not much would change with NickTunes Network for the time being. It would get a few logo changes and they'd update bumpers every once in a while. Then the network changed its name from NickTunes TV to NickTunes Network and then just shortened it to NickTunes. Until on February 25th of 2006, NickTunes would make their first original animated series for the network in Cap and Mikey, but it only ended off in the 52 episode rule and didn't have a wide enough appeal for general audiences. And after that, they'd then go on to make a slew of shows that were brain-numbingly boring to sit through as a kid. Oh my gosh. Like Wild Grinders and the NFL Rush Zone, which were instant channel changers for me. They did have a gem in Making Fiends, but that only lasted 6 episodes, so does it really count? But at this point, Nicktoons as a brand had been damaged and diluted so much that the term Nicktoons now meant nothing. For the children of the 90s and the early 2000s, the name Nicktoons meant quality. But for the new age of children, it was just a channel that they'd skip over while watching TV. SpongeBob was so successful that it killed off Nickelodeon's creativity, the very thing they wanted to uphold from the beginning. We started to slowly watch Nickelodeon's morals change, from creativity equaling profit to comfortability equaling profit. SpongeBob was their ticket to success, even if it meant they wouldn't have much else to offer. So as a result, not much else notable came from NickTunes Network. As time went on, the network changed. The days of promoting old cartoons and keeping the name alive were drifting away into the distance. And the network was just starting to become Nickelodeon Part 2 and would play more live action shows and sitcoms. Yes, on NickTunes Network. But they'd even move on from that and just resort to being reruns of SpongeBob and the Loud House. The Loud House is great, but spamming it isn't. And what really sucks is that this may never change. And while that's hard to accept, that doesn't mean that the memories that we grew up with can't still be carried with us till this day. The spirit of the old network may be gone, but our love for these characters and their stories will be with us forever. And that love can be shared with our friends and families while we're appreciating what a special time for animation this was to grow up in. And who knows, maybe one day Nickelodeon will pull the pin back out and put it back into the hand of its creators. After all, they did make the Netflix specials for Rocko and Invader Zim. And a few other modern cartoons have been great, although short-lived. But maybe Pan Pizza from Rebel Taxi is right. Maybe it's time to bring back 2D animation for theaters. Maybe that's where they could live on. Maybe that's where NickTunes could earn its respect back. But either way, I'm glad I got to experience what NickTunes were before the network existed. And I have Nick to thank for that.
The ability to see that this guy who worked on comics that weren't for kids, why I might be a good candidate for working on a kids show, I got lucky that someone thought that of me.
And for us, the theme of the whole series was always about balance. It was always not about good versus evil. It was about a world out of balance.
There is something comforting in knowing that you can make something that maybe is shown in another country, in another language, and that they find it funny too, and that maybe we all do have something in common. I think that's the thing I enjoy about it most.
4 notorious villains with a plan to destroy the NickToons universe will face off against a heroic foursome united in defending it. For the first time ever, Jimmy Neutron, Timmy Turner, Danny Phantom, and SpongeBob SquarePants join forces to battle the greatest criminal minds the NickToons universe has ever known. NickToons Unite! Saving the NickToons universe one world at a time.